Many monsters in Resident Evil have a filing code, not a name. A code. MA121, T103, FI03. Somebody sat in an office, in a meeting, with a coffee going cold next to them, and assigned these things product numbers. There are memos, there are budget lines, there are performance reviews. That's the bit I find genuinely strange about this series, and it's why I wanted to make this one. The creatures are horrible, obviously, but almost none of them are accidents of nature. They're products. Somebody signed off on them. So that's what tonight is. A slow wander through where these things actually came from. The labs, the paperwork, the people who thought any of it was a reasonable idea. 30 years of this franchise, north of 170 million copies sold, and underneath all of it is a filing cabinet. No particular order that matters. Nothing builds to anything. If you drift off somewhere around the giant sharks, you haven't missed a twist, because there isn't one. If you fancy more of this sort of thing, there's a subscribe button somewhere near this video. Otherwise, let's start with a flower. The flower grew in the ruins of an old garden in West Africa, in a place that had belonged to the Ndapaya people, and it had been growing there for a very long time before anybody with a clipboard turned up. It wasn't remarkable to look at. That's the part I always come back to. The single most consequential object in this entire franchise is a wildflower, and if you walked past it, you'd think nothing of it at all. But it carried something in it, an RNA-based virus that would eventually get called Progenitor, and which is old enough that people have speculated it's been knocking around for hundreds of millions of years. Long before anyone was around to be infected by it, the Ndapaya knew about it. Not in a laboratory sense, but they knew. The flower featured in their rituals, and the rituals killed most of the people who went through with them. The ones who survived came out the other side changed, and the stories about that made their way out of the region and eventually into a report that landed on the desk of a British aristocrat called Oswell E. Spencer. Spencer is the sort of man who could only exist in fiction, and I say that with real affection. Old money, scientific pretensions, and an absolutely enormous opinion of himself. He read about a flower that killed nearly everyone who touched it and thought, right, that's the foundation of a new human race, that is. He took two people with him, Dr. Edward Ashford, a virologist from another old family, and Dr. James Marcus, who was probably the best actual scientist of the three, and who mostly wanted to be left alone with his samples. They went to Africa, and in December 1966, they found what they were looking for. And this is where it gets a bit awkward, because sources disagree on the exact date. Some say the 4th of December 1966, some say 1967, and the wikis have been quietly arguing about it for years. I'm going with 1966 because that's what the internal timeline material leans toward. But if you've read otherwise, you're not wrong, you've just read a different document. The split between them is the thing that shapes everything else in this video. 3 men found the same virus and wanted 3 completely different things from it. Ashford was interested in the regenerative properties. He'd seen what it did to tissue, and he wanted to use it medically, to help people who'd lost the use of their bodies. That was, as far as anyone can tell, sincere. Spencer wanted weapons, and more specifically, he wanted a lever he could use to reshape the human species with himself somewhere near the top of the new arrangement. Marcus, bless him, just wanted the research. He genuinely does not seem to have cared very much about the applications. He wanted to understand the thing. Ashford died in 1968, and with him out of the picture, the medical argument died too, and Spencer and Marcus were free to get on with it. That same year, Umbrella was founded. I want to sit on that for a second because the timing tells you everything. The pharmaceutical company that becomes one of the biggest names in the world, that makes cold medicine and cosmetics and runs hospitals, was set up in March 1968 as a front. It was never a legitimate pharmaceutical company that went bad. It was a bioweapons program that needed somewhere to launder its research budget. And the pharmaceutical business was the disguise it picked. Everything Umbrella ever sold, legitimately, was in a sense marketing. There's a fun detail here that I think gets overlooked. They couldn't grow the flower. They tried. Obviously, they tried. You don't build a company on a plant and then not attempt to farm it. But the cultivation kept failing, and it turned out the flower would only produce the virus properly in its native soil, in that specific spot, under those specific conditions. Whatever was happening in the ground, there was part of the process. So the entire foundation of the most powerful bioweapons operation in the world rested on a single patch of dirt in West Africa that they could not replicate anywhere else. They had to keep going back. They had to maintain the garden. Decades later, there was still Umbrella staff whose job was, functionally, gardening. I find that hilarious in a way I probably shouldn't. The whole thing is a supply chain problem. The other problem was worse. Progenitor in its natural state kills nearly everyone it touches. Not most people. Nearly everyone. The theory that's floated around is that the virus was better suited to humans in the distant past and has drifted away from us over time, switching hosts and adapting until it stopped being compatible with us at all. By the time Spencer got hold of it, the mortality rate was effectively total, which is useless. You cannot build an army out of a substance that kills 100% of the recruits, and you certainly cannot build a master race out of it. So the actual work of Umbrella, the thing that occupied it for 3 decades and produced almost everything else in this video, was one very specific engineering problem. Take the virus, weaken it enormously, thousands of times over if necessary. Get the mortality rate down far enough that a meaningful number of people survive infection and come out stronger. That project got a name. They called it the T-Virus Project, and they split the work up between them so nobody had the full picture. Spencer handed his portion to executives at a laboratory in the Arklay Mountains. Marcus went off to run a training school with a lab attached. Ashford's son, Alexander, took the family end of it to a British estate, and then eventually to Antarctica. 3 research programs running in parallel, barely talking to each other, all chasing the same thing, which is roughly how you end up with giant zombie sharks. But we'll get to those. Since we're on the subject of the T-virus, it's probably worth actually explaining what it does, because I think the popular understanding of it is a bit off. The zombies are not the weapon. That's the thing that took me an embarrassingly long time to work out. And once you know it, a lot of the series reorganizes itself in your head. Umbrella was not trying to make zombies. Zombies were the failure state. Zombies were what happened when the process didn't work, which was most of the time. Here's the actual mechanism, as plainly as I can put it. Progenitor rewrites genetic code. That's its defining property, the thing the researchers got excited about and called the DNA mutation attribute, which is a very dry name for something that turns a person inside out. The problem is that the rewriting is uncoordinated. It doesn't build anything. It produces strange growths and protrusions and abnormalities all over the body, in no particular pattern, and then the host dies. So the work was about control. Splice the thing with other genetic material, dilute it, aim it. Over the 1970s, that meant a lot of work combining Progenitor with Ebola, culminating in the creation of the tyrant virus in 1978. The alpha strain is where the zombies come from. What alpha does is produce a condition the internal documents call cannibal disease, and that name is doing an enormous amount of work. The virus destroys higher brain function, memory, language, recognition, anything that makes you a person, while keeping the body running. Not healthy, running. The organs fail and it doesn't matter. The tissue rots and it doesn't matter. As long as the muscles can still contract, the thing keeps moving. And then it does the cruel bit. It accelerates the metabolism enormously, which means the infected are starving, permanently, unfixably starving at a rate no amount of eating can keep up with. That's the whole behaviour. That's why they shamble towards you. There's no malice in it, no hatred, no hunger for brains specifically. There's a body that is burning through its own reserves faster than it can replace them, running on a brain that has been reduced to a single instruction, and the instruction is eat puis. I think that's genuinely one of the better ideas in horror fiction. It reframes every zombie encounter in the series as something closer to a medical emergency you're trapped inside. There's a knock-on effect that comes up later, so I'll flag it now. When an infected body can't find enough to eat, it doesn't just stop. It goes into something like hibernation, a state very close to death, where it lies still and waits. That matters. Hold on to it. Now, by 1978, the direction of the whole project shifted, and this is where the ambition starts showing. The original brief had been the traditional one, a virus that's incredibly contagious and kills absolutely everyone, wipe out the enemy population, walk in, very clean on paper, completely unworkable in practice, because a disease that kills that fast burns through its hosts before it can spread properly. The maths of a rapidly lethal disease spreading properly does work. It never has. So they changed the target. Instead of a virus that kills, they wanted one that transforms, something that makes hosts physically stronger and keeps them functioning through injuries that should be fatal. An enemy soldier who becomes your problem for the other side. And crucially, one that spreads the infection onward through bites, doing your work for you. The beta strain came out of that, and with it came a number I keep thinking about. Roughly 10% of people are resistant. 10%. 1 in 10 walks through the outbreak and doesn't turn. Now, if you're a normal human being, that's a hopeful statistic. If you're the research team at Arclay, it's a hole in the product. You've deployed your weapon across a city, 90% of the population has been converted into a shambling hazard, and 1 in 10 is still standing there, with a rifle and a grudge. So the T-Virus project expanded, and the new objective was not improve the virus. The new objective was build things that can go into that city afterwards and kill the survivors. That single line in a project brief is responsible for most of the creatures in this video. The hunters, the chimeras, the tyrants. Every horrible engineered thing Umbrella ever put a development code on exists because someone did the arithmetic on that survival rate and decided it was unacceptable. The other thing worth understanding is the brain damage, because it became the defining constraint on the entire product line. A weapon that can't follow orders isn't a weapon, it's a hazard. Umbrella spent decades trying to engineer something that kept the strength and the durability, but retained enough cognitive function to be told where to go. Nearly everything in the early catalogue fails that test. The zombies obviously fail it. Most of the animals fail it. When you get to the tyrants, you'll see them solving it, sort of, and then discovering a much funnier problem on the other side. One last thing about the alpha and beta era, and then I'll move on. The infection speed varies enormously depending on how you catch it, and the game files are weirdly specific about this. A bite takes a while, hours, sometimes longer, and there are documented cases of people staying lucid long enough to write about what was happening to them, which is horrible, and also produces most of the best reading material in these games. Direct exposure is faster, and there's at least one recorded case of somebody being infected by touching a single contaminated leech, which is an absurdly efficient transmission route that Umbrella somehow never pursued. That's the T-Virus, a weakened descendant of something ancient, sanded down over 3 decades until it stopped killing everybody outright and started doing something arguably worse. And here's a fun detail to finish on. The name isn't a mystery or a code. The T stands for tyrant. They named the virus after the product they hoped it would eventually make, years before they managed to make it. That's the corporate optimism of the whole operation in one letter. But now, let's talk a bit about what happens if you leave one of the infected lying on the floor and don't do anything about it. Because the Arclay staff found out the hard way, and the policy they came up with afterwards is one of the grimmer bits of housekeeping in this series. The staff at Arclay started burning the bodies, not as a containment measure, not to stop the spread. They'd already lost that fight. By the time this became policy, the facility was gone, and the people making the decision were infected themselves. They started burning the bodies because of what the bodies did if you left them alone. The internal term for it is V-act, and it's a secondary mutation. A zombie that's been put down but not properly destroyed doesn't necessarily stay down. Given time, the tissue starts regenerating. The virus goes to work a second time on a body it has already ruined once, and what gets up is not what you shot. The version they encountered at Arclay is the crimson head, and the name is literal. Necrosis and blood seepage turn the skin a deep red, right through. The nails harden into claws. The muscle structure rebuilds itself into something that can run and jump and take considerably more punishment than it could the first time round. The speed and aggression come up a bit as well, which is not a sentence I enjoy typing. The cause was the epsilon strain, which had been developed as part of the tyrant work and got released during a lab accident. Nobody planned crimson heads. Nobody wanted them. They were a side effect of a strain that was meant to be doing something else entirely, in a building where the containment had already failed, and the staff had exactly one encounter to learn from. There's a specimen in the records referred to as Crimson Head Prototype 1, and the encounter with it was brief and violent, and afterwards an informal policy went round the facility: destroy the bodies, burn them, take the head off, wreck the legs, anything that removes the possibility of the thing standing up again. Informal policy, not a directive from management, not a safety protocol. A thing the surviving staff told each other because they'd watched it happen once. Now here's the bit I actually find clever, and it's a piece of retroactive law writing that I think deserves more credit than it gets. Crimson heads basically appear in one game. If you've played the 2002 remake of the first game, you know them intimately, because they turn the whole thing into an exercise in resource anxiety. And if you've played anything else in the series, you may have wondered where they went. For years the answer was just they were a remake thing. But the law does have an explanation, and it's a good one. William Birkin got hold of the T-virus strain data after the Mansion incident. And Birkin, as we'll get into properly later, was constitutionally incapable of leaving anything alone. He took the VACT strain, refined it, and produced a variant that does the same trick. Triggers a second mutation in a zombie that's been weakened or has run out of things to eat, but produces a completely different result. That's the liquor. And the process is genuinely nasty. The brain expands. Not metaphorically, it grows until it shatters the skull from the inside and comes out through the top, at which point the membrane around it toughens up enough that the exposed brain can take a bullet and keep going. The skin sloughs off entirely, leaving raw muscle. The bone structure reorganizes for movement on all fours. The nails become long-hooked talons, similar to a tyrant's, and the tongue extends into a barbed whip that can punch through a person, or take their head off. The eyes go. They're not covered, they're not damaged. They're just gone, because the thing doesn't need them. What it uses instead is hearing, and it's ferociously acute, which is why the correct way to move through a room with a liquor in it is slowly and quietly, and why the wrong way is basically anything else. The other thing that happens is a partial return of intelligence, not much, but that expanded brain buys back some of what the zombie lost, which puts the liquor in an unpleasant category, smarter than the thing it used to be, while being much less recognisably human. I've got a soft spot for how this is documented, honestly. Two enemies that look nothing alike, that show up in different games, that behave completely differently, And the official explanation is that they're the same process running on two slightly different strains. One accidental, one deliberately engineered from the accident. That's the pattern with Birkin, by the way, and you'll see it again. Umbrella has an accident. Birkin reads the report. Birkin makes it worse on purpose. There's a variant worth a quick mention. Lickers can be pushed further with additional tampering into forms the files call evolved lickers and licker beta, which are exactly what they sound like: bigger, tougher, and produced deliberately rather than stumbled into. They turn up in a few places across the series. None of them improve on the original design, in my opinion. The first one was already the right shape. And there's one more detail I like, which is about who gets to become what. There's a suggestion in the material that the subjects infected artificially in a controlled setting, the ones injected in a lab under supervision, don't undergo VAC the same way. It's the ones who caught it naturally, out in the building, through a bite or a scratch or contaminated water, who come back the second time, which is a horrible little inversion if it holds. The people who were experimented on deliberately get a cleaner end than the ones who were just working there. Anyway, that's the thing about the Arklay facility that I keep coming back to. It wasn't a monster factory in any organised sense. It was a research site where a large number of separate programs were running at once. And when the containment failed, they all failed together. And the results started interacting with each other in ways nobody had modelled. Since we're on the subject of things that facility made without meaning to, we should probably go and have a look at the animals. Because the mansion had a menagerie, and some of it was intentional, and some of it very much wasn't. Forget the plot for a bit. I want to just walk through the place. The Arklay laboratory sat underneath a mansion in the mountains outside Raccoon City, with a separate dormitory building nearby where the lower-ranking researchers lived and worked. And the animal program was spread across all of it, in rooms that were never designed to hold what ended up in them. Start with the spiders, because they're the least ambitious thing down there. The web spinners were an early attempt at seeing what the virus did to arachnids, and the answer was, makes them enormous, and not much else. They got to roughly the size of a large dog. They kept the wall crawling. They lost the ability to spin webs entirely, because they'd outgrown the biology that made it possible, which is a very funny thing to lose in an experiment where the animal's name is web spinner. Intelligence stayed where it was, or dropped, which for a spider is not a long way to fall. As a weapon, useless. As a thing to encounter in a corridor, extremely effective. And I say that as somebody who does not love spiders at the normal size. The dogs worked though. That's the Cerberus program, and it's one of the few animal projects Umbrella considered a genuine success. Dobermans, infected, and instead of the usual outcome, bigger, dumber, uncontrollable, you got something trainable, fast, aggressive, capable of taking a command. The skin comes off in patches, and the muscle shows through, and they look like something that should have been buried, but functionally, they work, which tells you the problem wasn't the virus. It was the animals. Dogs already come preloaded with the thing Umbrella wanted, which is a willingness to be told what to do. Then there's the sharks. I love the sharks. Project designation FI-403, nicknamed Neptune, and it is the single most Umbrella thing in the entire catalogue. Somebody at that facility looked at a research budget and thought, right, but does it work on great whites? It does. That's the finding. That's the whole finding. The T-virus works on marine organisms. Confirmed, thank you. And the mother specimen grew to a size that would look at home in a summer blockbuster. And then nothing. Because a giant shark cannot be controlled, cannot be given an objective, and my favourite detail in the whole programme, cannot be transported. Even if you'd found a use for it, you'd then have the problem of getting around 2 tons of infected great white to the target. There is no version of that logistics meeting that ends well. So the only value Umbrella ever extracted from Neptune was a line in a report confirming that yes, this works underwater too. And a flooded chamber in the basement with the results still swimming around in it. The snakes were more of an accident of geography. Adders lived in the Arklay Mountains, including a few up in the trees in the mansion courtyard, and one got brought inside as a specimen and infected. It grew. It grew a lot, big enough to swallow an adult whole, and it became hormonally unstable and far too aggressive to work with. The staff called it Yawn, after the way its mouth opens before it strikes, which is the kind of nickname you only give something if you've watched it do that more than once, and I don't love thinking about the circumstances. And there was secondary exposure out in the forest. Other adders picked it up from eating contaminated animals, and they didn't grow to that size, but they did become noticeably more aggressive and considerably more venomous. Which means the mansion had a contamination footprint reaching out into the woods before anything else had gone wrong at all. Now the Plant 42, was not an official bioweapon. It was a botany experiment being run by a researcher called Henry Sarton in the dormitory on a plant growing at a spot the records call Observation Point 42. That's the whole naming convention. It was the 42nd thing they were watching. Then the outbreak happened, and it got a second, uncontrolled dose, and it went absolutely mad. It grew until it broke through the walls and the door. Its roots went down through the building to the flooded chamber below, where it started drawing chemical compounds straight out of the water. The main bulb fused itself to a ceiling. It put out vines with heavy bulbs on the ends, and it used those to defend itself. And it stopped photosynthesizing in any meaningful way because it had found a better food source. It drank the researchers, several of them. When they came to destroy it, it caught them with the tendrils and drained them of blood. And it did this in the building where they lived. And the notes describe it learning to manipulate doorknobs, which means at some point somebody in that dormitory heard a handle turn and knew exactly what was on the other side. I don't know. There's something about a plant doing that. Nightmare fuel, honestly. They worked out a chemical that killed it, a compound in the files as UMB number 20, which everyone calls V-Jolt, and the plan was to feed it directly into the roots. They never managed it. Some of the accounts say the researchers were too far gone with their own infections by then. Some say the flooded chamber was the problem, because that's where the sharks were. Which is a lovely bit of design, actually. The reason they couldn't kill the plant was the other failed experiment. Last one. The Chimera, human-fly hybrid. Insect DNA grafted into human embryos, named after the Greek thing made of mismatched animals, which is at least honest. It came out with wings too small to fly and an incomplete exoskeleton, and the ability to move along floors, walls and ceilings without slowing down. Fast, resilient, and with roughly the intelligence of the insect it borrowed from, which killed it as a product. They needed something that could take orders, and they'd built something with the reasoning capacity of a bluebottle. The design was never refined, the project went nowhere, and the specimens stayed in the basement lab and treated that section as their territory. And that's the through line for this whole floor of the building. Almost none of it got disposed of. The sharks stayed in the water, the plants stayed in the dormitory, the chimeras stayed in the basement. Umbrella built things, wrote them off as commercially unviable, and then simply left them where they were. Which brings me to the one experiment down there that wasn't an animal at all. And this is for my money the saddest thing in the entire franchise. It starts with an architect. George Trevor was a good one, well regarded, and in 1962 he got a commission from a wealthy client to design a house in the Arklay Mountains. Money, no object. The client had opinions, mind you. He wanted hidden rooms, concealed passages, mechanisms built into the structure, and he was insistent enough about it that a more suspicious man might have asked why. Trevor didn't. He treated it as a design challenge, which is exactly what a good architect would do, and he estimated 5 years to build it. There's something so ordinary about that. A professional getting an unusual brief and thinking, well, that'll be interesting. His wife Jessica and his daughter Lisa travelled out ahead of him. They were taken as soon as they arrived. Not months later, not after some falling out. On arrival, Spencer's people brought them down to the laboratory under the house. And when George turned up days later, he was told they'd gone to visit a sick relative. Jessica was injected with one strain of Progenitor, Lisa with another. Type A and Type B, the records call them. And the whole point of the exercise was to find out how a human body handled the virus without engineering, because at that stage, nobody knew. Jessica reacted badly. Her mental state came apart within days, which is consistent with the brain damage the virus does, and she started planning an escape she was in no condition to attempt. She was assessed as a failed experiment. She was executed, immediately, and without any particular ceremony, and that ended any chance Lisa had of getting out of there. Lisa's body did something else. She survived. More than survived, she developed genuine physical strength beyond what a person should have. Not to the degree a properly engineered strain would later manage, but far enough to be interesting to the people watching. And that is the worst possible thing that could have happened to her, because it meant she was useful. She stayed under that estate for the next 28 years. 28, through the completion of the laboratory, through the arrival of new research teams, through changes of management and shifts in the project's direction. They kept injecting her because she kept not dying, and every new strain they cooked up needed a body to test it on, and hers was the one that never gave out. Her records were kept internally by Umbrella. Her name was removed. Most of the researchers at that facility didn't know she existed, and the ones who did know didn't know who she was. She was a specimen with no file attached to it. For much of the first 20 years, she was fed intravenously and moved by wheelchair chained to a bed on the off chance she recovered. The people who did interact with her had a name for her. It wasn't a name, it was an insult. That's what she got called. I want to be careful here, because this is the point in the story that gets used for shock value, and I don't think it should be. Her mind went. It was always going to, and what was left of it was hanging on to one thing, which was her mother. At some point, somebody at the facility, and I have never seen a satisfying explanation of why, sent in an employee to impersonate Jessica. Whether that was a test or a crude attempt at keeping her calm, or somebody's idea of an experiment in cognition, I genuinely don't know. She worked it out, and she took the woman's face off, and she tried to bring it to her mother. That's where the faces come from. She wore them, stitched together, and the standard reading is that it's a horror image, and it is. But it's also somebody with the reasoning capacity she had left, trying to solve a problem. She had been looking for her mother for decades. She kept finding people who weren't her, so she took the parts she thought might be wrong and tried again. Shinji Mikami designed her hoping players would get past the revulsion and land somewhere near sympathy, and I think that's the correct response. She is not a villain. She is not even really a monster in the way the rest of this video's subjects are. She's the longest-running victim of a corporate research program, and she's the only one in the building who was there before any of it started. The last piece is 1988, and it's the one with consequences. Umbrella's European division had built a parasite called the NER type. The idea was to replace the brain functions of a bioweapon with something they could steer, and it did not work. It killed every single host within about 5 minutes of implantation. Almost every one. The American research team wanted the project for themselves, so they needed a test subject who might survive it, and there was exactly one candidate on site. They put it in Lisa. She didn't die, she absorbed it. The parasite got as far as her brain and then simply stopped existing, and afterwards her cells had changed in a way nobody had predicted or asked for. That's where the G virus came from. Not a lab, not a design document. It cultivated itself inside a woman who had been infected with so many different things over so many years that Her biology had become its own environment. They extracted it from her in 1988. And after that, and I find this the coldest detail of the lot, Umbrella's interest in her tailed off. She'd produced the thing. There was nothing else they needed. So she just stayed down there. When the mansion incident happened in 1998, she got out of confinement and moved through the estate, and she encountered the STRS team more than once. And there's an incident where she recovered her mother's skull from the family crypt and threw herself into a chasm with it. That should have been the end. It wasn't. She survived the fall, as she had survived everything else, and climbed back up. She spent her last hours following Albert Wesker around the grounds. Nobody's confirmed why. The reading most people go with, and the one I believe, is that she recognised his face from the years he'd spent experimenting on her. She was pinned under a fallen chandelier and killed in the explosion that took the mansion down, which is the closest thing to mercy anybody in that building ever arranged for her. There's another name from that era worth spending some time with, because 1988 was a busy year for Umbrella, and Lisa was not the only thing that got dumped somewhere and refused to stay dead. The first thing you notice is the singing. There's an operatic voice moving through the corridors of an abandoned training facility, and it's not atmosphere, and it's not a sound cue, it's functional. The singing calls the leeches back. Every one of them out there in the water, and the walls responds to it, because they came from the same source, and that source is calling them home. I think it's one of the best sound design decisions in the series. It shouldn't be frightening. It's just a man singing, and it's deeply unpleasant every single time. So, James Marcus, of the three founders, he was the actual scientist, and I said earlier that he mostly wanted to be left alone with the research. That's true, and it's also far too generous because of what he did with the time. He ran Umbrella's executive training school in the Arklay Mountains, which was a real institution with real students, young people being groomed for management positions in a growing pharmaceutical company. Wesker arrived there at 17, Birkin at 15. That's the sort of place it was, at least officially. Marcus used the students as test subjects. Not all of them, and not openly, but the number that came out later is somewhere around 20 people. Trainees, kids in some cases, given what the entrance ages seem to have been. He wasn't doing it out of cruelty in any theatrical sense. He was doing it because he needed human data, and there were humans on site. And to him, those two facts resolved into each other without much friction. He was also, quietly, taking money from somewhere he shouldn't have been. There's a funding trail running back to a body called the F Foundation from at least 1986, which was a front for an outfit called the Connections, a rival shadow organisation who will become very relevant much later in this video. Marcus was, functionally, their man inside Umbrella. Spencer worked it out, or worked out enough of it. He'd already decided Marcus was a liability, too isolated, too obsessed, sitting on research the company wanted and refusing to hand it over, and the funding business made the decision easy. In 1988, an Umbrella security service team went into the lab and shot him. Wesker and Birkin went with them, not as observers. They were there to collect the research data while the body was still on the floor, and they took it back to Arklay and built their own careers out of it. Those were his two-star pupils. He'd taught them both. Then they dumped him, body into an underground river channel, along with the specimens nobody wanted. And among those specimens was his most recent creation. He'd been working on leeches for years, annelids exposed to Progenitor, which is an odd choice until you look at what leeches do. They're already built around getting inside a host and taking what they need, and the culmination of that work was a single specimen the files call the Queen Leech, his best result. Finished more or less right before he died. It went into the water with him, and it was hungry. What happens next is one of the more upsetting sequences in this franchise, even though you never see any of it. The Queen Leech found the body, which was the only food source available, and entered through the mouth, and consumed him from the inside out. slowly, over a long time. And when it reached the brain, specifically the hippocampus, which is the bit that handles memory, it took everything that was in there. It woke up, genuinely woke up, with sentience it had never had before, and it woke up holding a full set of somebody else's memories. It knew the name James Marcus. It knew the research. It knew about Spencer and the betrayal, and the two students who'd stood there while it happened. It had opinions about all of it. And being a leech with no prior sense of self to compare against, it concluded that it was James Marcus, not a copy, not a thing carrying his memories, him reborn, and Marcus had been a Christian, so the memories came with a framework that made divine resurrection the obvious explanation. I don't think it's ever quite worked out that it's wrong. That's my reading anyway. There's no moment where the mask slips and something underneath acknowledges what it actually is. It just carries on being him. For 10 years in the dark. 10 years is how long the shape-shifting took. It learned to hold his form, his young form, from decades earlier, which is its own strange detail, and by 1998 it could pass. Then it came out and started settling accounts. In May it got into the Arclay laboratory and released the virus and staged the whole thing to look like a research accident. That's the outbreak everything else in this video's first half comes from. The mansion incident, the crimson heads, the creatures loose in the forest, all of it traces back to a leech with a grudge. In July it went after the training school itself, and Umbrella's investigation teams got torn apart by leeches, and then on the 23rd it hit the Ecliptic Express, a passenger train carrying Umbrella staff through the mountains with a swarm. The infection through leech contact is fast, not the slow, lucid decline of a bite. Minutes. Wesker and Birkin, who'd been assigned to reopen the old training school, saw the footage and recognised exactly what they were looking at. Couple of details to finish on, because the biology is genuinely strange. The queen is hermaphroditic, like ordinary leeches, but she's gained self-fertilisation on top of it. So she is, on her own, an entire breeding population. She needs damp, and she cannot tolerate direct sunlight. And the sunlight thing appears to have been designed in deliberately, as a control measure, something to cause pain and keep the specimen where it was meant to be. Which didn't work, obviously. He got out of the building the same way he got out of everything else, by waiting. But now, let's get back to the things Umbrella built on purpose. Because while all this was going on, the actual product line was coming along nicely. And the first thing they ever managed to sell was designed from the start to be horrible to look at. The green was a decision. That's the detail that changed how I look at hunters. The scaled skin, the sickly colour, the hunched posture, and the long dangling arms, none of that is an accident of the biology. It was a design goal. Somebody specified that the finished product should provoke revulsion in anyone who saw it, and the development team delivered. Which is a strange thing to put in a brief for a weapon that's meant to kill everything in the room anyway. If it works, nobody's looking at it for long. But there it is in the design intent. Make it upsetting to look at. The shriek is the same. Hunters vocalize before they attack. This rising, unnatural noise that tells you exactly where they are and gives away the ambush. From a pure efficiency standpoint, that's a flaw. From a psychological warfare standpoint, it's the point. Let's do the build because it's genuinely nasty. The prototype was MA121, and the process went like this. Take a fertilized human embryo, roughly 3 weeks along. Introduce the virus, then incorporate reptilian DNA, using the virus as the bonding agent. That's the actual mechanism. The T virus is what lets two incompatible genomes hold together. Then wait, about a year. That's the development time from injection to a finished, combat-capable specimen. I want to sit with that because it's easy to skim past. The thing that comes around the corner at you was, 12 months earlier, a 3-week-old human embryo. And the reason the process works at all is that at that stage, there's very little there yet to resist being rewritten. MA120 was never put into production. It performed well enough in combat testing to earn the name Hunter, and then the evaluation data got rolled into the next version. That's MA-121, the Hunter Alpha, and this is the one that made Umbrella actual money. The Alpha was the first fully functional, genuinely marketable bioweapon they ever produced, and the reason wasn't performance, it was cost. Cloning technology had come far enough that they could reproduce a proven specimen cheaply, over and over, without going through the whole embryo process each time. Low development cost, low unit cost, reliable output, which turned Umbrella's bioweapons division from a research money pit into a business. The Hunter project itself dates back to 1981, so this had been in development for the better part of 2 decades before anybody outside the company met one. And the specification is exactly what you'd expect from the brief we talked about earlier, something that goes into a contaminated area and kills the survivors. Fast, durable, and equipped with claws capable of taking a person's head off in a single pass, which is the Hunter's signature, and which the games are extremely willing to demonstrate. Then came the variants, and honestly, this is where it gets a bit comic, because once you can clone the thing cheaply, there's no reason to stop tinkering. So you get the Beta, developed to improve on Birkin's Alpha work. You get the Gamma, which went in an amphibian direction and came out looking like a frog that's given up on life, and which is somehow more disturbing than the reptilian original. You get the Mu, a smaller model kept at Umbrella's facilities in Raccoon City. That one deserves a pause. The Mu was inferior in mobility and combatability compared to the other models, and its actual purpose was training. It was a practice target. Umbrella kept a stock of downgraded bioweapons at head office so that development staff working on Tyrant-class projects had something live to test against. There were hunters in the office building, as equipment. There's also the R series, which is the direction I'd have expected them to go in from the start, larger, tougher, built as a proper frontline unit, rather than a clean-up tool. The Mu was scaled down from those, which is how you end up with a training target that's a shrunken copy of a heavier model. And somewhere in there is the Sweeper, which is the variant I find most objectionable on principle. The Sweeper's contribution to the design is venom. It carries a toxin in its claws, so a wound that doesn't kill you outright will leave you poisoned until you cure it with blue herbs or mixed herbs, and regular first aid spray will not help with it. That's not a performance improvement, that's just spite, engineered in and costed out. Then there's the Delta, which was a cost-cutting exercise, a cheap prototype meant to squeeze more life out of an aging product line. And by that point the writing was on the wall, because the Hunter program had stopped being a priority. Here's why, and it's the most mundane thing in this entire video. In 1999, the United States government imposed a business suspension order on Umbrella. Not a raid, not a military operation, a regulatory action. And the practical effect was that the Chicago branch closed, and the Hunter development data had to be packed up and shipped to the Russian branch, under the supervision of a man called Sergei Vladimir. Meanwhile, the rival company, the outfit Umbrella spent years pretending not to worry about, had got hold of stolen development data and used it to produce their own versions. The Hunter 2, the Sweeper, both more effective than what Umbrella was still selling. So Umbrella's flagship product got outcompeted in its own market by a company using Umbrella's own research. That's not a horror story. That's a business failure. And I find it genuinely funny that after everything, the human embryos, the 2 decades of development, the deliberate design work on making it upsetting to look at, the Hunter line's actual ending is a regulatory closure and a loss of market share. One more thing before I move on, because it's a small detail I like. The hunters that appear in the mansion during the 1998 incident weren't loose by accident in the way the sharks and the plants were. They were released deliberately as part of a cleanup operation. Umbrella's response to losing control of the facility was to send in more of the product. And there's a version of this I keep imagining, where somebody sat in a meeting and presented the hunter as the solution to a containment problem that Umbrella had created using a weapon Umbrella had built to clean up an outbreak of a virus Umbrella had made in a building Umbrella owned. A closed loop of a company selling itself the solution to its own product. Anyway, the hunters were never the end game. They were the thing that paid the bills, while the real project carried on in the background, and the real project had a name from the very beginning. That brings us to the tyrants, and the whole line has one flaw running through it that they never properly solved. Let's start with the coat. Everyone knows the image. Enormous pale figure, long trench coat, hat sometimes, walking at a perfectly steady pace through a police station. And the coat reads, as a stylistic choice, a bit of theatre. Somebody at Capcom deciding a monster in outerwear is funnier and scarier than a monster without. It's a limiter. That's the in-universe explanation, and it's much better than it needed to be. The coat is a restraint garment. It's there to hold the specimen's physical output down to a manageable level, because a tyrant operating without restriction burns through itself and becomes uncontrollable. The coat is a governor on an engine, which means every time you watch one of them tear the thing off, you're not watching a monster get angry. You're watching a safety system get removed. Right, the line in order. The proto-tyrant came first, and it's a mess. They gave it the maximum viable dose of the virus on the theory that more input equals better output. And what came back was strong and durable and profoundly stupid. Intelligence never developed to anything like the required standard. It couldn't follow commands. And the skin degraded badly, which is a cosmetic problem right up until it becomes a structural one. Research was suspended, data collected, specimens scheduled for disposal, despite being very nearly finished. And then, and this is the pattern I flagged earlier, so I'll keep it brief, they didn't dispose of it. It got moved from Arclay down to another laboratory to wait, and it was still waiting when two STRS members broke into that facility and let it out. The data went into the Tiabuiro 2, which is the one that turns up at the end of the mansion incident, and it's a substantial improvement. Better physical capability, and crucially, intelligence high enough to understand and execute complex instructions. That was the breakthrough. That was the thing 30 years of work had been aiming at. It's got the exposed heart, which is a design compromise nobody was thrilled about. The cardiovascular system had to be scaled up so much to support the body that it wouldn't fit inside the rib cage. So it sits outside, on the surface, pulsing away, and it is exactly as vulnerable as it looks. The T103 is where it becomes a product. Developed in May 1998 from modified clones of the T002, and the number is deliberate. Not 003, but 103, marking it as the true mass production model rather than another prototype. Mass production ran at a facility on Sheena Island, and the T103 is the one that solves the ordering problem properly. Intelligence close to a normal human, capable of tasks earlier bioweapons couldn't manage. They were used as bodyguards, as assassins sent after named individuals, as retrieval agents for objects Umbrella wanted back, and as muscle for situations involving armed opposition. They can also track by scent, which gives them limited friend or foe identification. Limited. Keep that word. Now I have to talk about the neurotransmitter, and this is the single worst thing I found while researching this video. The problem with mass production was compatibility. Most bodies rejected the process. The solution they landed on was a substance called norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter produced by neurons in the locus coeruleus, which is a small structure in the brainstem. You cannot synthesize it. You have to take it out of people. So Umbrella needed a supply. And the supply, according to the internal material, came from the homeless, from transients, and from people brought in from poorer countries, chosen specifically because nobody would come looking for them, abducted, processed, and used up. And there's one more line in that documentation, which is that the subjects had to be kept anesthetized, awake, because the compound they wanted is stress-related, and sedating the donor reduces the yield. That's the sentence I keep coming back to, not because it's gory, the games never show you any of it, because it's an optimization. Somebody ran the numbers, noticed that anesthetic was costing them product, and wrote it into the process. Every mass-produced tyrant in this series is downstream of that room. Right, let me get back to the mechanics, because there's a good bit coming. When a T-103 takes enough damage, it undergoes an aggressive mutation, and what it reverts to is essentially a more feral version of itself. Claws sprout on both arms. The heart begins to become exposed through the chest, somewhat like the T-02's. It gets substantially faster, and the sense system stops working, which means it loses friend or foe entirely and attacks everybody in the area, including whoever deployed it. The failure mode of Umbrella's most refined product is that it forgets whose side it's on and reverts to the design they spent decades trying to move past. Then there's the flaw that runs through the whole line, and it's the one I find most interesting. Leave a tyrant alone for long enough, months, according to the development notes on the T-02, and it develops a sense of self. Not intelligence. They'd already achieved intelligence, self. It starts having its own view about things, and it stops taking orders, and there is nothing in the biology that lets you take that back. The entire T-103 program was, in large part, an attempt to fix that. Improve the control, shorten the leash, keep the thing obedient. And what they produced was something that follows instructions beautifully right up until it's damaged, at which point it stops distinguishing between targets and friendlies. They never solved it, they just moved the failure somewhere else. Last one for this section. Thanatos, made by a researcher called Greg Mueller during the Raccoon City incident, and it breaks the pattern in a specific way. Where the T-103 came from a pre-existing cloned embryo, Thanatos was built from a single specific individual, a named man. It's got the exposed heart of the older models and was built for speed and jumping ability rather than raw mass, with oversized clawed hands for stabbing. Umbrella wanted to mass-produce it. Mueller objected strongly because he wanted it to remain unique, which is a very odd thing to get precious about. But then, that's the man who built it. Now, one tyrant got a completely different upgrade, and it's strange enough to deserve its own section. Because somebody eventually found a use for that parasite. Let's talk about the parasite on its own first, because the host is honestly the less interesting half. The any A-type looks like a brain. That's the shape of the main body, a mass of tissue with the folds and the general architecture of one, which is not a coincidence, because it's meant to do a brain's job. In some versions it's bioluminescent, which means the inside of the thing glows faintly. Out of that main body come tentacles, lots of them, some growing to remarkable lengths, and they're strong enough and dexterous enough to punch through bone without much effort. They do two jobs. The first is control. A tentacle works its way up through the host, crosses the face, usually destroying the nose on the way, which accounts for a lot of the appearance, and pierces through the front of the skull into the forebrain. And once it's in there, it isn't influencing the host, it's replacing the relevant function. The parasite is holding the steering wheel directly. The second job is chemical. As the tentacles grow through the body, they secrete a fluid continuously, and that fluid contains a compound that increases the potency of the virus already in the host. So the parasite doesn't just take control of the body, it makes the body better while it's doing it. That's the design. Engineered by Umbrella's European division, and the intent was to solve the control problem from the other end, instead of trying to build A bioweapon, smart enough to take orders. Build one with a driver in it. It failed for the most boring possible reason. Only a Tyrant-class body survived the implantation. Most hosts died within about 5 minutes, with Tyrants as a rare exception, and a control system that kills its subject is not a control system, except for one which we've covered and which gets exactly 1 sentence here. The only body that ever absorbed it was a Tyrant body, and it became Nemesis. So the Nemesis project stalled. Not cancelled, stalled. It sat there through the 1990s waiting for something the researchers didn't have, which was a body durable enough to survive the process. Then in 1998, the Tyrant line finally delivered one. And that's Nemesis. The whole thing is a collision of 2 programs that had each hit a wall, a control system with nothing to control, and a weapon that had to be told what to do. Put them together, and both problems go away. The results are grim in a way I think the games undersell. You get a Tyrant-class body with the strength and durability that implies being driven directly by a parasite, with a chemical process running in the background that keeps boosting the virus load, and you get regeneration that's coming from both sources at once. The virus rebuilds cells rapidly, and the parasite has its own regenerative capability on top, which is why Nemesis can be functionally killed and keep getting up. It isn't a plot device or a difficulty setting. There are 2 separate systems. In there, repairing the same body, and knocking one of them out doesn't stop the other. The other thing the parasite gave it was the ability to use equipment. I don't think that gets enough credit. A rocket launcher, a flamethrower. The thing carries and operates military hardware, reloads it, and adjusts its approach based on what you're doing. Earlier bioweapons could be pointed at an area. This one can be given a job. And the job was STRS. That's the bit that makes it different from everything else in this video. Nemesis wasn't deployed to clear a district or suppress a population. It was sent to Raccoon City to hunt down and kill the surviving members of one specific police unit, the people who'd been through the mansion and knew what Umbrella had been doing there. It's a clean-up operation with a name attached. I'm not going to walk through the plot of that game, because you know it, and because the biology is the more interesting half. But I do want to flag the design work, because it's some of the best in the franchise. The trench coat is doing the same job it does on the other Tyrants, a limiter, holding the output down. The bindings and the stitching across the face aren't decorative either. They're keeping a body together that has had something quite substantial installed inside it. And as the fight goes on and the damage accumulates, all of it comes off, and what's underneath is progressively less humanoid and more parasite. By the end, there's very little of the original body left doing anything. It's mostly the passenger. There's a variation worth mentioning because it changes the reading. In the reimagined version of the story, the origin is presented quite differently, with a genetically engineered parasite involved instead, which is a legitimate creative choice. And I don't mind it, but I do think something's lost. The original version has a specific horror to it, the idea that the intelligence stalking you through the city isn't the monsters. The monster is just the vehicle. One last detail, and it's a small one, but it's stuck with me. The parasite achieved sentience of a sort in Lisa, and it achieved control in Nemesis, and in neither case did anybody get what they actually wanted. The European team wanted a steering system. The American team wanted the project. What they got out of it was one of the most effective bioweapons ever fielded, and a virus that terrified their own executives. And neither of those was on the requirements document, which is a decent summary of Umbrella's entire research history. When I think about it, they almost never got the thing they were aiming at. They just kept finding something worse on the way past. There's one more thing that came out of the American labs that year, and it's the one that finished Raccoon City off. So let's talk about the man who made it, because his story is a career before it's a monster. He was 15 when he arrived at the training school. That's worth holding on to, because everything about William Birkin gets read backwards from the monster, and the monster is the result of a 20-year career. Before that, he was a prodigy who got recruited absurdly young, spotted by a company that specialised in spotting people like him, and put in a building run by a man who was quietly using students as test material. By his late 20s, he'd been handed a senior research role at Arclay, in exchange for helping himself to his teacher's research. By his 20s, he was running the place. And by 1988, he'd found the thing that would define him, which he did not create and did not design and mostly just noticed. We covered where it came from, the parasite, the woman who absorbed it, the cells that changed afterwards. I'm not doing that again. What matters here is what he did next, which was to look at an anomaly in someone else's failed experiment and immediately understand that it was more important than anything Umbrella was working on. He isolated it. He called it G, and then he had to sell it internally, which was harder than you'd think, because the product people hated it. Here's why. G alters a living organism repeatedly and unpredictably. Not once in a controlled direction, the way a properly engineered strain does. Repeatedly. It'll change a host and then change them again, and the second change doesn't follow from the first in any way you can model. It also repairs damaged cells aggressively and can revive the dead. Every one of those properties is a nightmare if you're trying to sell weapons to a military. Armies want predictable. They want a spec sheet. They want to know that Unit A does thing B for duration C. A bioweapon that mutates into something new every time it takes a serious hit is not a product. It's a liability with a delivery schedule. So the tyrant people wanted nothing to do with it, and they were right on the merits. Spencer authorised it anyway, not for the weapon's value, for the other thing, the eugenics project that was the actual point of the company, the one the entire bioweapons division existed to fund. A virus that rewrites a living human repeatedly and can bring back the dead is not interesting to a general. It's extremely interesting to a man who wants to build a superior species and rule it. So G got set up as its own research program, separate from the T-virus project, with Birkin running it. Early work happened in France. Then it came to the underground laboratory beneath Raccoon City, and he spent a decade on it. He was not finished in September 1998. That's the crucial fact, and it's the one that kills him. By then, Umbrella had lost patience. He'd been slow-walking the handover, keeping the research close, negotiating for terms, and the company decided it wasn't negotiating anymore. They sent a retrieval team into his laboratory to take the samples by force. They shot him. Badly, but not immediately, fatally. And they left him there with a case of unfinished virus and a few minutes to think about it. So he injected himself. I want to be fair about what that decision actually was, because it gets described as madness, and I don't think that's right. He'd spent 10 years on it. He knew, better than anyone alive, what it did to a compatible host. The intended outcome was something the documents call a G-human, which is essentially an improved person. Enhanced, functional, intact. That's what he was reaching for as he bled out on the floor. He didn't get it, because the virus was already completed, and because you cannot correct for that with willpower. What he became instead is what the files call a G creature, and the distinction is the whole tragedy. Severe deformity across the whole body, rather than clean enhancement. And then the second part, which is progressive, a G creature slowly loses all self-awareness and intelligence, mutation by mutation, until there's nothing steering it at all. And what's left when the mind goes is a single instinct, and the instinct is to reproduce, specifically to implant offspring in blood relatives. Which brings us to the second transmission route, and it's the nastiest mechanic in the series. G mutants produce embryos, natural offspring, in the loosest possible sense, and the delivery method is oral implantation. The creature forces an embryo down a host's throat, and from there, one of two things happens. If the host is closely related to the parent, there's a strong chance the embryo merges into the body and turns them into a G as well. That's a success in the virus's terms. If the host isn't compatible, the embryo forces its own way out, within minutes, killing them. So a scientist who wanted to improve the human race ended his career as an organism whose only remaining drive was to find his own family and do that to them. That's the horror of it. Not the size, not the eyes, not the arm. The specificity of the targeting. Which is why his daughter spends her portion of that story being hunted by something that used to be her dad, and why the whole Raccoon City sequence is structured the way it is. She is the compatible host. She's the only one in the city he'd actually succeed with. She survived it, with help and with a vaccine, and a great deal of luck. But she carries the antibodies afterwards, and that becomes enormously important later on, in a way that nobody in 1998 could possibly have predicted. Her blood ends up being a component in something built 15 years later by a completely different organisation. I'll come back to that. It's one of my favourite connections in the whole series, precisely because it's so unglamorous. A sample taken from a traumatised child, filed away and eventually used as an ingredient. One last thought on Birkin. There's a version of this where he's the villain of the piece, and there's a version where he's a man who was recruited at 15 by a company that ate people and who did to others roughly what had been done to him, and who died reaching for the one thing he'd built that he thought was actually good. Both are true. I lean toward the second one most days, but talking a bit about the other side of the family business. While all this was going on in America, the Ashfords were doing something completely different in Antarctica, and theirs is the one that reads like a Gothic novel. Alexia Ashford got the idea from an ant colony. She'd been studying them, and what interested her wasn't the organisation, or the labour, or any of the usual things people find fascinating about ants. It was the dependency. Kill the queen and the colony eventually dies without her. Not disperses. Often, it eventually dies if the queen can't be replaced. The whole structure is contingent on one or a few reproductive individuals, and every other member of it exists in relation to them. She was a child when she worked out that she wanted that arrangement, with herself at the centre of it, and she spent the rest of her life building towards it. Let me back up, because the family's essential here. Edward Ashford was one of the three founders. He died in 1968, and his line inherited both his shares and his research, and his son Alexander took over. Alexander was not a good scientist. That's the thing driving everything that follows. He knew it, everybody around him knew it, and he was carrying a family name that had been prominent for generations and was now visibly declining under his management. Umbrella's other divisions were producing results. His weren't, so he came up with a plan to fix the Ashford name, and it is completely deranged. His ancestor Veronica Ashford, the first Countess, the founder of the family's reputation, had been renowned for an extraordinary intellect. She'd also been dead a very long time, and her body had been embalmed and preserved. So he took tissue samples from the corpse. The technique he worked out was, on paper, quite elegant. Reconstruct the base alignment of her genes, implant them into an unfertilized egg, and use an electrical process to trigger fertilization without introducing any other genetic material at all. No farther. The result would be a clone of Veronica, and the Ashford line would have its genius back. It half worked in 1971. Instead of one clone, he got twins, a boy and a girl. The boy, Alfred, came out inferior. Not remarkable. Clever in the way a bright person is clever, which was not what the project was for. The girl, Alexia, came out as very nearly a perfect copy, including, and this is the part Alexander seems not to have thought through, the temperament. Veronica had been noted for a superior intellect and for a total absence of the ordinary human breaks. Alexia inherited the complete set. By 10, she was doing work that adult umbrella scientists couldn't follow. By her early teens, she was effectively running a research facility. Then in December 1982, Alfred told her about a room. There was a hidden chamber in the Antarctic base, and it needed the family gemstones to open. She gave him hers, a large ruby set in a silver choker, and the two of them went in and read the project files, and found out what they were. Not children, products, a restoration project for a family reputation, designed and executed by the man they'd been calling father, using a dead woman's tissue. A month later, they took him. She injected him with T. Veronica, and I should explain what that actually was, because it's her real achievement, and it's genuinely impressive work. She'd taken Progenitor, the original, the thing from the flower, and bound it together with the remnants of an ancient virus recovered from inside a queen ant. That's the ant obsession showing up in the chemistry, and what she was aiming for was the thing Umbrella had been failing at since the beginning, an infection where the host keeps their mind and controls their own mutations, rather than being flattened by them. On her father, it did not work. He wasn't a prepared host. The virus was new, and what happened to him is one of the most upsetting images in the series. He mutated into something the files call Nosferatu, and the description is worth going through slowly. Bald, pale green and blind, the eye sockets are empty, and there's a leather mask with metal clasps buckled over them. His movements are restricted by a heavy leather garment clamped around his legs. His arms are bound behind his back with leather and metal restraints, and out of his back come 3 long appendages, like spider legs, which is how he attacks despite being tied up. So he's not merely a failed experiment. He's a failed experiment that has been dressed, restrained, masked, and put in a cell underneath a research base at the bottom of the world. His children did that to him, and then they left him there, and he stayed there for 15 years. Alexia's verdict on the whole business, delivered much later, was that the mutation was simply how she dealt with insignificant creatures. She had no more interest in him than that. Then she took notes on him. That's the part I find genuinely chilling. She watched her father's mutation carefully, identified the flaws in her virus from what went wrong in him, and used that data to plan her own infection properly. He was the pilot study. And when she infected herself, she did something nobody else in this series has done. She went to sleep, 15 years in cryogenic suspension, deliberately, to give the virus time to bond with her body, slowly and completely, instead of tearing through her the way it had through him. She was betting the whole back half of her youth on a theory about pacing. The theory was right. She is, as far as the records go, the only host who ever achieved complete conscious control of her mutations, able to change form at will, repeatedly, without losing herself in the process. Everything Umbrella had been chasing since 1968, achieved by a woman who'd been asleep for the entire back half of the company's history. And here's the detail that finishes it, and it's the best constructed thing in the older games. Alexander, before they took him, while he was watching his daughter work and slowly realizing what she was building, got frightened. Not of losing control of the company, of her. He understood, better than she credited him for, that if T.A. Veronica ever got out, it could change the shape of the world. So he built a weapon, in secret, hurriedly, designed for one purpose, to destroy T. Veronica cells. It was called the Linear Launcher, and he had it installed at the Antarctic base against the possibility that his own daughter would one day need to be stopped. That's what killed her. The thing her father made, left in a cupboard for 15 years, waiting. Now this next one has nothing to do with Umbrella at all, which is a large part of what makes it interesting. There's a piece of amber with something in it. That's where I want to start because it reframes the whole thing. Amber is fossilized tree resin, and what people usually find inside it is an insect from millions of years ago, preserved beautifully and completely dead. What's in this one isn't dead. Las Plagas is a genus of parasitic arthropod, and the striking thing about it, the thing that makes it different from everything else in this video, is that it's real in its world. Nobody made it. There's no development code, no founder, no meeting. It's an organism that evolved, and one of the things it evolved was the ability to sit in an embryonic state for an extraordinarily long time, waiting. Which is why the amber matters, preserved in resin, dormant, and still viable. The origins are genuinely disputed in universe, which I appreciate. There's a Spanish population that may go back to the Bronze Age, roughly 4,000 years. There are desiccated remains found in the ruins of the Ndapaya Kingdom in West Africa, which is the same site as the flower, and which raises a possibility the series never quite confirms, that the parasite and the virus came out of the same place, and that Progenitor may have got into these things a very long time ago and shaped what they became. Some sources push it back much further than that. Nobody can prove any of it, and the series is content to leave it that way. What we do know is what happened in Spain, and it's more folklore than science. There's cave art in the region depicting the rituals, including human sacrifice. So the parasite was integrated into local religious practice for a very long time before anyone in a lab coat turned up. And at some point, a nobleman called Count Gregorio Salazar decided to put a stop to it. He ran a crusade against the villagers, who worshipped them, brutal by all accounts, and when it was done, the surviving parasites were sealed into caves beneath a mound, cut off from the nearby village by a deep valley and a large body of water. And then a fortress was built on top of them. And here's the bit I love. The Salazar family stayed, generation after generation, each one taking the title of Castellan, and the actual hereditary job, the reason the castle exists, was keeping the things underneath it buried. That's a family business spanning centuries whose entire purpose is a lid. It held for a remarkably long time. And then around the turn of the millennium, a man called Osman Sadler dug them up. Sadler discovered Las Plagas in the sealed ruins, which gave the whole thing a nice symmetry, and he revived a cult called Los Iluminados around them. And the current Salazar, Ramon, a young man who'd inherited a job he never chose, was persuaded to open the door. Now, the biology, because this is the cleverest system in the series. There are two strains, the subordinate species and the dominant species, and the difference between them is everything. A subordinate plaga takes a host and hollows out their agency. The person doesn't die and doesn't rot. They keep their body, their strength, their ability to use tools and speak and work. What they lose is themselves, and the symptoms are horrible in a domestic way. Fainting spells and severe hallucinations before the process finishes. Those are the ganados, villagers, farmers, people who are doing something ordinary and are now doing something else. A dominant plaga is different. The host keeps their sense of self. They stay a person with a personality and opinions and plans. But the remake adds a detail I think is a real improvement, which is that the price is corruption. The personality doesn't survive intact, it curdles. You get to keep being you. You just get worse. And here's the mechanism that ties it together. A dominant host emits high-frequency signals, and the subordinate hosts respond to them, which turns a mob into an army. Ganados on their own are erratic, dangerous, but disorganized. Ganados, under the direction of a dominant host, become coordinated, tactical, capable of setting up an ambush and holding it. That's a command structure grown inside people's bodies. Then the experiments start, and this is where the shapes get strange. El Gigante, a specially made plaga variant, implanted in a human host, producing unrestrained muscle growth until you have something several times the size of a person. As a weapon it works. It's enormously effective. The problem is that the same variant produces severely diminished mental activity. So what you get is a very large, very strong animal with no capacity to be directed, which made it dangerous to the ganados as much as anyone else. So Los Iluminados produced only a small number and scattered them around. 2 in the castle undergrounds, 2 stored in the mines once the village had no use for them. Stored, that's the word in the material. They put them away like equipment. Garrador is a different approach, blinded, with enormous claws mounted to the arms, and hearing sharp enough to compensate completely. And unlike the Gigante that's not a side effect, somebody chose the blindness, because a creature that can't see and hunts by sound is one you can position in a room and leave. The Novistadors are the ones with 2 origin stories, and I find the disagreement fascinating. In the original, they're presented as a predecessor to the Verdugo, surgical experimentation on human hosts, spliced with insect DNA. The remake goes somewhere considerably worse, establishing that at least the first generation came from plaga secretions injected directly into a woman's womb, producing hybrids that were born rather than made. Either way, you end up with humanoid insects that can camouflage themselves. The name means roughly the unseen. Pick whichever origin you prefer, they're both awful. But now, let's move up the hill to the castle for a bit, because the Salazar household is its own separate business, and the staffing arrangements there are extraordinary. The Verdugo is the best designed thing in this whole affair, and the remake made it better. 2 of them served Ramon Salazar as bodyguards, hidden under enormous cult robes, one in red, one in black. Underneath, they're human and insect fused, with a plaga in complete control. And the remake tells you who the red one was: Isidro Uriarte Talavera, the Salazar family butler. Sadler noticed him, not because of his position, because of his mind. He was a scientist by inclination, working as household staff, and Sadler was interested enough to give him a dominant plaga rather than the subordinate one the servants got, which means Isidro kept himself, and then he spent the next 6 years running the experiments that produced the rest of it, on Ramon's instructions, before eventually being turned into one of the results. The red one was the housemaid. I keep thinking about the household staff meeting where that got decided. Then there's the Regenerador, and I'll say plainly that I think it's the most frightening enemy design in this franchise. Not the strongest, the most frightening. Sadler stopped trying to make better Ganados at some point and started trying to make actual bioweapons, and the Regenerador is where that went. The trick is multiple parasites in a single host, not one, several. And what they give it is a healing factor that borders on absurd. Blow parts off and they grow back. There's no meaningful damage state. The only way to kill one is to find the individual parasites inside it, which requires a thermal scope, which means the correct way to fight the most terrifying enemy in the series is to stand still and look at it carefully through a lens while it walks toward you. Whoever designed that encounter deserves a raise and possibly a caution. The Iron Maidens came out of research into whether the Regenerador was actually viable as a weapon, produced on an island facility. And the difference is the needles, spines growing out through the whole body, which turn the grab attack into something considerably worse. And Luis Sierra, who worked on all of it before changing his mind about the whole enterprise, established the detail that makes it hopeless. You cannot surgically remove a juvenile plaga if there's an adult present in the host. It kills them. The only safe option is radiation therapy, and that requires equipment and time and a facility, which means for almost everybody in that region, by the time anyone knew what was wrong, it was already far too late. And that brings us to somebody who looked at all of this, the viruses, the parasites, the whole miserable catalogue, and concluded that the actual problem was people. The whole thing starts with a conversation in a big, empty house. Spencer was very old by then, and very ill, and living out in an isolated estate with the company he'd founded in pieces around him. And Albert Wesker came to see him, and Spencer told him what he was. Not a recruit, not a talented employee who'd risen through the ranks. A product. There had been a program, a set of children selected and enhanced, raised with Spencer's ideals installed deliberately, intended to become the first generation of a superior species, with Spencer somewhere above them as a sort of god. Wesker was one of those children. Most of the others didn't make it. I've always thought the interesting thing about that scene isn't the revelation. It's that Wesker doesn't reject it. He kills Spencer, obviously, but he doesn't reject the philosophy. He accepts the entire framework, the eugenics, the superior species, the idea that humanity is a rough draft, and concludes only that Spencer was the wrong man to be holding the pen. So he took the job. Work on the Ouroboros project began around 2006, and to do it he needed money and facilities, which he got from a pharmaceutical company called Tricell. He'd stolen Umbrella's research data back in 2003 and handed it over, which bought him a partnership and a very well-funded laboratory. And the laboratory went in a place that made me laugh when I found it. They built it into the caverns of the old Underpire Kingdom, right next to a decommissioned umbrella facility whose entire function had been procuring the flower. Umbrella had been maintaining that garden for decades, keeping the wildflowers blooming, cultivating samples on site. Because of the soil problem we talked about at the start, the company collapsed, the facility was abandoned, and the garden was still there. So the final act of this whole 40-year story happens about 100 meters from where the first one did. That's not an accident of writing, that's a deliberate circle, and I think it works beautifully. Now the science, because Wesker's approach is the opposite of everything that came before it. Umbrella spent 30 years trying to bring the mortality rate down, weaken it, dilute it, splice it, get more people through the process alive. Every strain in the first half of this video is a step in that direction. Wesker thought that was the mistake. His reasoning went like this. If the point is to produce superior humans, then a virus that lets ordinary people survive is defeating its own purpose. You don't want a high survival rate. You want a filter, something that kills anyone without the right genetic characteristics and enhances anyone who has them with nothing in between. So he pushed the mortality back up, deliberately, toward the original. The first prototype was too poisonous even for that, which is quite an achievement. So the strain was refined using antibodies drawn from Jill Valentine, who'd survived long-term viral exposure and whose blood carried something they needed. She was held for years and used as a source, which is a horrible thing to be reduced to, and which the games treat with the seriousness it deserves. What came out is Ouroboros, and the outcome for an infected person is binary, adaptation or rejection, nothing else. If you have the genetics, in theory, you're enhanced, physically and mentally, into something like what Wesker had become. If you don't, your body comes apart, and what emerges is a mass of black tentacles that swirls and spreads and consumes any other biological material it can reach. Not a creature, exactly. A tide. It's also weak to heat, which is the practical detail that keeps it beatable. And the delivery plan was appalling. Not a city, a missile with a satellite dispersal mechanism, releasing it into the atmosphere globally, all at once. Every person on the planet processed by the same filter simultaneously. That was the plan. That was the actual proposal. Here's the part that gets me though, and it's the whole reason I wanted this section in the video. It didn't work. Not the plan, the science. As far as the records go, Albert Wesker is known to have successfully mutated from Ouroboros infection. Except Albert Wesker was the only one ever enhanced by it. There are 3 people who didn't get destroyed by it. Wesker himself, another member of the Wesker program, and a man called Neil Fisher. And in every case the reason is the same, and it disqualifies them. All 3 were already mutants before they were exposed. Their bodies were running on something else, which changed how the virus behaved in them. Wesker's own transformation at the end isn't a Ouroboros success either. He'd been enhanced by a progenitor-derived strain decades earlier, and his body simply had a different relationship with the thing than anyone else's. So the doomsday weapon designed to identify humanity's superior specimens and elevate them has a confirmed success rate among normal human beings of 0. There's a much simpler explanation for that than the one Wesker had, which is that his filter wasn't measuring what he thought it was. The population able to survive progenitor infection was tiny to begin with. That's the first thing Umbrella established when they set up in those caverns, and it's the reason they had to keep modifying the strain in the first place. He built a machine to sort the human race into worthy and unworthy, and the machine's actual output was unworthy for essentially everyone, including the categories he'd have counted as promising. I don't think he ever quite absorbed that. There's a version of that character who understands he's failed, and it isn't the version in the game. One last thought on this one, because it connects backwards in a way I like. Everything Umbrella built was an attempt to make Progenitor usable, safer, more controllable, more commercial. Decades of engineering, all in one direction. And the last thing anybody made with it was an attempt to undo all that work and get back to the original, on the grounds that the original had been right all along, which means the entire scientific history of this series is a very long round trip that ends where it started, in a cave next to a flower. Now, let's talk a little about the one that spread the fastest, because while Wesker was building a filter for the human race, somebody considerably less grand was distributing something in syringes to soldiers who'd been told it was a supplement. They were told it was an energy booster. That's how it went into Edonia in December 2012. A civil war, an under-equipped militia called the Edonian Liberation Army, and a woman turning up with syringes and a story about nutritional supplements that would help them fight better. They injected themselves, voluntarily, enthusiastically, in some cases queuing for it. I find that a more upsetting delivery method than any of the aerosols and missiles elsewhere in this video, because it doesn't require anything except being tired and outgunned and offered a bit of help. The woman was Carla Radames, and her story deserves telling properly because she's one of the better written villains in the series, and she gets overlooked. She was a prodigy, scouted straight out of graduation by a foundation connected to an organisation called The Family, an old, wealthy, extremely private group who'd taken the view that bioweapons in warfare were inevitable, and that since the United States had gone quiet on the subject after 1998, somebody would have to fund the research privately. On the government's behalf, as they saw it, whether the government wanted them to or not. Their man was Derek Simmons, and Simmons used Carla for years. Her research and then, eventually, her body. She was experimented on against her will, and what came out the other side was not the same person. So Neo Umbrella, the outfit she eventually built with embezzled money, is not a corporate revival. It's a revenge project with a logo. Now the virus, and this is my favourite bit of assembly work in the franchise, the C virus, chrysalid virus, properly, was built by combining a modified strain of T. veronica with a G virus variant extracted from Sherry Birkin's blood. Sit with that for a second. That's Alexia's Antarctic work and Birkin's Raccoon City work, combined, using a sample taken from a child who survived being hunted by her own father, and who then spent years in government custody, partly because of what was in her blood. 3 games, 2 decades, and one of the most personal traumas in the series turns up 15 years later as an ingredient in a shopping list. I called it unglamorous earlier, and I stand by it. Nobody involved thought about her at all. She was a source. What the C virus does is a step past everything before it. The Javo are the baseline result, and they are not zombies in any meaningful sense. They keep their intelligence, much of it. They handle firearms competently, drive vehicles, coordinate, take cover, flank. A Javo is a person who has been converted rather than killed, which is precisely the thing Neo Umbrella ultimately achieved with the C virus. And then there's the regeneration, which is where it gets strange. Damage a Javo, and the injured part doesn't heal back to how it was. It rebuilds into something else. Lose an arm and it might come back as a long blade of bone. Take out the legs and they might reform as insectoid limbs, built for speed. The mutations have names drawn from Serbian because of where the virus was first deployed. One for the scythe arm, another for the jumping legs, a whole catalogue of them. So the enemy gets more dangerous specifically because you shot it, which is a genuinely mean piece of design, and I admire it. Then if a Javo takes enough damage, or reaches the end of what its body can sustain, it does the thing the virus is named after. It cocoons. The skin hardens into a shell, a chrysalid, a proper pupal stage, and inside it the virus dissolves the body entirely and rebuilds it from the components. What comes out is not an improved Javo, it's a different organism. The files call them complete mutation species, and the word complete is doing a lot of work, because there is nothing of the original left. And what specifically comes out depends on what animal genes were in the strain that infected them. That came out of an earlier project. During the work on cloning Ada Wong, Carla found the virus could be used as a retroviral vector to preserve specific traits through the process, and researchers extended that by adding animal genetics, with the result that the creatures emerging from the chrysalids reflected whatever had been added. So you get a swarm of wasp-like insects sharing one collective mind. You get a reptilian thing that fires quills, each one a person who was, 20 minutes earlier, a soldier holding a rifle. I think that's the single grimmest process in this entire video, and it's competing with a strong field. Which brings me to Ustanak, and the relationship there is worth naming. Ustanak is to the Javo roughly what the tyrants were to the zombies. The elite build, the one that got attention, over 100 test subjects died producing it. That's the figure in the material, and it implies they were using a specialized strain, with a lethality high enough to make the process almost unsurvivable, on purpose, to find someone compatible. What they got was more intelligent than a Javo, not merely retaining human intelligence, but exceeding it, which is an effect inherited all the way down from Progenitor. And that created the problem this series has had since the very beginning, the one the Tyrant program never solved and that we've watched fail repeatedly. How do you control something clever? Umbrella's answers were chemistry, hardware, coats and limiters, and parasites in the skull. Carla's answer was a relationship. She built the control on a bond modelled on mother and child. The creature's former sense of self was largely gone, but the affection for her predated the process and survived it, and that was the leash. Not a compound, not a restraint, attachment. And it worked better than anything Umbrella ever fielded. It followed instructions, it pursued a specific target across continents for months, it adapted, and it kept coming back after defeats that should have ended it. There's a detail I can't stop thinking about. When Carla died, it knew. Nobody told it. There's no established mechanism for it. It simply knew, and everyone who's written about it has had to note it and then move on, because there's no explanation available. The final piece is Jake Muller, who was in Adonia as a mercenary when the syringes went round, and on whom the virus had no effect whatsoever. He's Wesker's son. He inherited an immune system that shrugs off things that dismantle other people, and Carla worked out what that meant immediately. His blood could be used to make the whole thing better, which she did, producing an enhanced strain that skips the chrysalid stage completely and lets a host mutate indefinitely without losing structural integrity. Only she knew how to make it. Which means when Ada Wong killed her in China in 2013, the formula went with her. Since we're on the subject of things that were never really weapons in the first place, let's talk about the mold. A tanker in a hurricane off the coast of Louisiana, October 2014. That's where an infiltration weapon stopped taking orders and everything that follows comes out of a bad night at sea. Let me set it up properly. The mold is a genus of fungus, and unlike almost everything else in this video, it wasn't engineered from Progenitor at all. It's its own thing, from an Eastern European mountain range, and its relationship with people goes back centuries, folklore rather than science, for most of that time. It only became a subject of proper study in the early 20th century. Samples got out in the 1990s, acquired by the Connections, the same shadow organisation that had been quietly funding James Marcus decades earlier, which is a connection I enjoy far more than I should, and what they wanted it for was mind control. That's the sales pitch, and it's why Eveline's existence caused such alarm in the industry. A weapon that ends a battle by taking over the people fighting it makes conventional bioweapons economically pointless. It also makes firearms, chemical weapons, and, the documents say this outright, nuclear weapons obsolete as strategic instruments. If your enemy's soldiers simply stop being your enemy's soldiers, none of the rest of it matters. So they built E-001. She was made from two things: a mold sample supplied by a woman in that mountain village, and DNA taken from that woman's dead daughter. And then she was artificially aged until she looked about 10 years old, because a small child is the most effective infiltration package there is. Nobody searches a lost child. People take them in. That decision is the whole horror of the project for me. It's not the fungus. It's the product design meeting where somebody said, "Make it look like a little girl. They'll open the door." Controlling her required an entire apparatus. 2 handlers, immunized against her influence, carrying stabilizing compounds to keep her regulated. Specialized tracking equipment, calibrated to her specific biochemistry. And, this is the part that ruins everything, the handlers were instructed to imprint themselves as family, to act as her parents, so she'd bond with them and be easier to steer in the field. They raised a weapon as a daughter, deliberately, as a control measure. Then the hurricane hit, and she went out of control and infected her handler, and vomited mold across the entire ship. Everyone aboard died or became something else, and 2 people came ashore. Mia, one of the handlers, and Eveline. The bakers found them. I want to be clear about this because the game does an excellent job of it, and I think people forget. The bakers were fine. Ordinary family, running a plantation property in the Louisiana swamps. And when 2 people washed up after a shipwreck, they took them in and looked after them. That's the entire crime. The infection is slow, and it's the worst thing about the whole scenario, because for a while, everybody knows something's wrong. Marguerite went to a doctor. She had an X-ray and the doctor found mold on her skull and asked her to come back for further testing. She meant to. She'd planned to. And the infection took her before the appointment. That's such a small, ordinary, awful detail. A follow-up appointment she didn't make. What she became is genuinely one of the most unpleasant things in this series. She kept regenerative capability like the rest of the family, and on top of that she developed the ability to produce and control insects, a mutation in her lower abdomen that functions as a hive. She births them, she directs them, and she guards the house with a lantern, which people read as atmosphere, but which I suspect is an insect trait showing through, because insects go toward the light. Then there's the detail I find quietly devastating. When she dies, every insect she ever produced dies with her, instantly. All of it was her. Her infection was being deliberately held, at stage 2 incidentally, because Eveline had cast her as the mother and wanted her functional. When Eveline changed her mind and went back to preferring Mia, the restriction came off, and Jack's infection ran ahead to stage 3 during the fight, which is why he comes back with those elongated limbs. She isn't transforming out of rage. She's been let go. Jack got the regeneration in its most extreme form, and he's essentially unkillable through most of the game. And what finally undoes him is a specialised anti-mold serum. He learns that Marguerite is dead mid-fight, and he stops, and he says her name. He also asks later, in a moment where the influence loosens, for someone to free his family. Not save, free. Lucas is the outlier, because Lucas was already like that. The mould didn't make him build the traps. It just removed the reasons not to. And the moulded, the black, wet, humanoid things that come out of the walls are the mould-infected victims. That's what they are. Everyone Eveline infected was transformed into a moulded. Travellers, drifters, people brought to the property specifically so the bakers could infect them. And when they didn't fit, they were killed and transformed into moulded. There's a whole category of enemy in that game whose lore is, she didn't like them. And there's one more of them, which nobody realises at the time. Ethan Winters gets to the end of a much later story in a mountain range a long way from Louisiana and takes an injury nobody walks away from. And while he's lying there, Eveline turns up. Not in the room exactly, but present, the way something that has been living in you tends to be. What she tells him is that he stopped being alive quite a long time ago. He takes that as a comment on the wound. It isn't. She's pointing back much further, to a night in a farmhouse and a first meeting with a man holding a shovel, and to the fact that whatever got up afterwards and kept going was a body the fungus had rebuilt and gone on rebuilding ever since. Which puts the man you spent that entire game playing as into the same category as everything else in this video. He hadn't worked it out, nor had anyone watching. Blue Umbrella had been studying the fungus for a while and came up with a countermeasure, which is a nice piece of specificity. Mycetotoxic rounds, ammunition carrying a compound that's released on impact and destroys fungal membranes so they can't regenerate. It doesn't kill outright, it just switches off the healing and makes the target vulnerable to ordinary damage. They also managed a cure for the infection, which can be produced in the field, which is more than anyone ever achieved for the T-virus. And when mold-based organisms die, they calcify. The body crystallizes and breaks apart into fragments. A clean, dry, strangely dignified ending compared with what happens to everything else in this franchise. Worth remembering, because you'll see it again shortly. And there's one more place all this comes from. The village where the sample was taken. Because everything we've just been talking about, the mold, the connections, the little girl grown from a dead child's DNA, is downstream of one woman standing in a cave in 1919. She went into the cave to die. That's the beginning of it. A woman called Miranda, born in a mountain village in Eastern Europe in the late 19th century, who had a daughter called Ava in 1909. In 1919, the influenza pandemic reached the village and went through it, and the death toll was high enough that the cemetery filled up completely and people had to bury their families outside the village boundary because there was nowhere left. Eva was 10, and Miranda walked into a cave in the hills with the intention of ending it there. What she found instead was an enormous ancient fungal colony growing under the mountain. She touched it and got, all at once, the memories of hundreds of people it had consumed over the centuries. Everyone who'd been buried in that ground had gone into it eventually, including Eva, whose body had been assimilated almost immediately after burial. So Miranda came out of that cave with a religion. She gave the thing a different name, went back to the village, and carried out very different actions than infecting and curing people. Then she stood up in the local church and used those recoveries as proof of what she was. It worked, though, not for the reason the villagers thought. The mould has mind-altering effects, and a congregation that's been infected is not making free decisions about theology. Within a very short time, the village had abandoned its faith entirely and started calling her mother. And then she got to work, and she worked for the better part of a century. What she wanted was simple and never changed, a body capable of hosting a copy of Eva's consciousness. Everything else, the cult, the experiments, the lords, the whole apparatus, is instrumental to that. The tool she developed is the Kadu, and I'll explain it once. It's another kind of organism, a parasitic entity of a different sort, that a different substance has got at and rewritten, and it goes into a host surgically. In a compatible subject, it produces enhancement. In most subjects, it does not, and most subjects meant most of the village. The overwhelming majority of implantations failed. People either died outright or became lichens, the rejection outcome, where host and parasite are simply incompatible, and the result is something wolf-shaped and feral. Here's the part that tells you exactly who she was. She didn't kill them, she exiled them, sent up into the hills to squat in an old ruined fortification, and left there. For decades, nobody in the village treated them as an emergency. They were something you factored in, like weather or wolves, an occasional raid, a few animals gone, and then quiet again. And the reason she didn't simply convert the whole village is the part I want to be precise about. She needed the villagers intact, not out of sentiment, not out of restraint. She needed a supply of bodies to keep implanting, and you cannot draw from a population you've already used up. So the people down there were being farmed. That's the arrangement. Their entire function was to keep producing candidates. The lichens, for their part, are considerably more capable than they look. Their intelligence sits near enough to a person's that they use bows, ride, and put together rough armour. They organise, they hunt in groups, and there's a clear pecking order among them. They also store what they catch by stringing it up to come back to, which is normal predator behaviour, and knowing that does not help at all. The largest of them was Urias, originally the chief of the community, whose infection went the same way as everyone else's except that he grew enormously instead of merely changing. He carries a war hammer and can throw stone columns. His name comes from a Romanian word meaning giant, and he had an older brother, larger, stronger, with growths and tendrils across the back and armour like protrusions around a face that resembles a wolf mask, who was kept in the mould beneath the village and released later as a last line of defence. Moreau produced the varkalac, which are wolf blood injected into a lichen's spine, an offshoot of an offshoot, rarer than the lichens, and treated by them as attack dogs rather than equals. Fully animal in intelligence, walking on all fours with a gait that puts the knees near the ground. Then there are the 4 houses, who were the promising results. 4 families with ancient claim to the region, and their descendants happened to be the 4 people whose bodies reacted usefully to the Kadu. None of them were viable hosts for Eva. Everyone was a failure by the only measure Miranda cared about. But she recognised their standing, adopted them as her children, and let them rule. They ruled appallingly, which is rather the point. At the castle, the daughters, and their manufacture, is the strangest process in the village by some distance. 3 women, almost certainly staff, were put under and given the parasite. What the parasite did next was breed, hundreds of eggs, and what hatched out of them wasn't anything you'd call a creature. It was flies, or something the mould had built to resemble flies near enough to pass at a glance. Then the swarm ate the woman it had hatched inside, took a full copy of her genetics on the way through, and spent about a week reassembling itself into her shape. So what stands up at the end of that is a cloud of insects doing an impression of a person. And it's a good impression, good enough to sit at a dinner table. None of the 3 remembered a single thing about who they'd been before. The lady of the castle chose to raise them as her adopted daughters, and they lived that way, dining at the table, eating food brought by the staff, behaving like a family. And they could revert to a swarm whenever they wanted. Their weakness is the cold, which is a lovely bit of biology. Drop the temperature far enough, and the mould stalls out, goes dormant essentially, and they seize up into something solid that can actually be hurt. Which meant that in that mountain climate, their hunting grounds were restricted to the inside of the castle whenever the outside air was cold enough to be lethal to them. Everything in that building was designed around the fact that the daughters couldn't go outside. The staff who died down in the dungeons got the worst end of it because dying didn't finish the job. Moroica, they're called, and what comes back has none of the mind the woman had. Colourless, wrongly proportioned, fingers drawn out too long, and a mouth built for one task, which is opening a throat and draining what's behind it. The detail that sticks with me isn't the teeth. It's that the notes describe them as feeble, worn down by hunger and by everything done to them before they died, and never given the chance to recover from any of it. Somebody wrote that as a combat weakness. It reads as a post-mortem. Samka reads as a further stage of the same decline. The arms have become wings, membranes stretched between fingers that have been pulled far past their proper length. The elbows locked at an angle they can't come back from. Sight is mostly gone. The tongue has turned into something closer to a mosquito's, and the name is borrowed from local folklore, a creature blamed for sickness in expectant mothers and young children. Which means the village had a word ready for this shape long before anyone started producing it on purpose. At the house by the waterfall, Donna Benevento. Her parents died when she was a child, and she never really recovered from it, and she talked to people through a doll her family's craftsman had made for her, rather than talking to them directly. She came through the implantation almost unchanged. Same face, same mind, which by Miranda's standards made her worthless. And I think that's the most damning assessment in the whole village. The one who stayed a person was the failure. What she did gain was the ability to secrete a psychoactive compound that causes violent hallucinations, and she put it into the flowers growing around the estate, so anyone who wandered too close breathed it in on the way up the path. That's a defense system made of gardening, and I'd find it charming if it weren't for what happened to the people who fell for it, and she had part of her own parasite surgically removed and put inside the doll. The two fragments formed a smaller colony together, which lets her move it. Whether Angie actually speaks through that connection, or whether it's ventriloquism and Donna doing a voice, is not settled. I've read arguments both ways, and I genuinely don't know. I lean toward ventriloquism because it's sadder. Now the factory's worth taking on its own, because the man running it was the only one of the four who ever seriously tried to get out. Heisenberg hated all of it. He'd been taken and implanted, and the attempt to brainwash him only half took, and he spent his time building an army out of corpses from the village cemetery with the intention of using it on her. The soldats are those corpses. The heart comes out, and the parasite goes in where it was. The muscles get driven by current, and the skull gets fitted with hardware, because the earliest attempts had nothing on the head at all, and the results were completely mindless. They moved, but only to wreck things, and they couldn't be told anything. The headgear is there to hold the brain activity steady enough to take an instruction. Some of them have drills instead of hands, which I think tells you how much thought went into the design brief. The soft spot is on the body, and it glows because the mechanical reactor and mold-infected tissue inside are exposed there. Hit that, and the whole thing comes apart. They don't crystallize at the end either. Everything else in this village crumbles. These go the other way and collapse inward because of what's still running in the chest when the rest of it stops. Sturm is the one he wrote off and hung on to anyway. Where the head should be, there's an engine with blades on it. There are no arms because at some point it put them through its own propeller. It has almost nothing going on upstairs, and it cannot be directed in any useful sense, so it never got deployed for anything. It got parked downstairs instead, as a thing that lives at the bottom of the building and kills whatever comes down. And the notes record that the man who built it used to yell down the stairwell for it to pack in the noise because he was trying to work and the engine kept revving. Which is, when you think about it, the most domestic detail in this entire video. So that's the filing cabinet. I said at the start that almost none of this was accidental, and going back through it, I think that holds up better than I expected. The sharks were a line item. The hunters had a design brief that included being unpleasant to look at. Somebody wrote down that the donors had to stay awake. Even the mould, which nobody made, ended up with a project code and a handler roster and a decision about what age the weapon should appear to be. 30 years of this, and the thing that keeps it interesting isn't the monsters. It's that every single one of them has a paper trail leading back to somebody's desk. There's a new game out this year, as I'm sure you know, and it's brought a fresh set of things with it. I've deliberately left those alone tonight. The law hasn't properly settled yet, Most of what's out there is impressions and community notes, rather than the files and reports this sort of video runs on, and I'd rather wait until there's something solid to work from than guess at it. When that material exists, those creatures will get their own video, and I'm looking forward to it. There's plenty else I want to do with this, mind you. I've got a whole thing planned on Raccoon City hour by hour, from the first case at the hospital through to the end, because the timeline is much stranger than people remember. And at some point I want to properly go through Umbrella as a business. The share price, the government contracts, the suspension order, the whole collapse, because I suspect that's a better horror story than anything in the labs. If you made it this far, thank you. If you didn't, and you're hearing this on a rewatch somewhere around the middle of the night, that's more or less what it was built for. One last thing, and then I'll leave you to it. Of everything in here, the one I keep coming back to isn't a monster at all. It's the architect, a man who got a good commission, took it seriously, treated the odd requests as a professional challenge, and estimated 5 years. He was told his family had gone to visit a sick relative. He designed the building they were being held underneath. Everything else in this video is a product. That bit's just a person doing his job. Right, that's me. Sleep well.